Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to the Oraculos True Divination podcast, where I bring you ancient wisdom from the modern mystic. I'm your host, Mychal A. Bryan, and joining me today is my mentor supreme, classical astrologer extraordinaire, Dr. Lehman. Lee, thank you so much for being here.
Glad to be here, Mychal.
I'm super happy to have you here, Lee. And today we have so much wonderful things to speak about as it relates to both classical astrology and specifically horary astrology. And I can't wait to dive right in. But before we get into that, for those of you who are new to the Oraculos True Divination podcast, this is a podcast where I bring you interviews from the astrologers who are shaping the landscape of our astrology. So, if you love what you're hearing already, please do take a moment, I'll give you one, to go down below to like and subscribe to this YouTube channel. And apparently there's a bell someplace that you're supposed to hit as well in order for you to get the notifications. So if you find the bell, hit the bell so that you can continue to be notified about these wonderful and amazing interviews that I'm doing with these wonderful and amazing astrologers from all around the world. Now, Lee.
Mychal.
Wow, I feel like I haven't seen you in so long. I feel like I've grown some gray hairs in the process. Where
You're bearing them well if you have. I definitely have grown some gray hair since we talked.
Well, you were bearing them well as well, Lee. And I'm so thrilled to have you here and so thrilled to be here again in the space with you, because the last time I think that you and I were together in this way, I was studying deeply day in and day out with you. And now here we are doing this podcast.
You were obsessed.
Precisely. Now, Lee Lehman, you have done extraordinary work within the field of classical astrology, both scholarship and practice. And I don't want to be the one to tell people about that. I want you, Lee, to tell your story about how you came into classical astrology and how you came to do some of the extraordinary work that you've done within this field.
Well, I got into it accidentally, like everything, right? Specifically, I had my first astrology book was entitled The Ultimate Asteroid Book.
Yes, it was.
And this was basically because I had gotten into astrology, and then, like every young person in astrology who gets seriously, obsessively, deliciously hooked, realized that this was the path that I needed to be doing and that I would be doing for a long time, and that I needed to hook into the astrological community. Well, getting into the community and getting into it as a speaker and as a practitioner isn't always easy. And so I was doing computer consulting at the time for a living, and I needed to come up with a business plan. And what I discovered as part of the business plan was that the easiest way to get noticed was to be doing something nobody else was doing. And at that time in New York City, where I was, the doyen of the asteroid scene, Ellie Bach, had basically semi-retired. And so nobody was doing asteroids. And so I thought, I can do asteroids. So I learned some stuff about asteroids, and I started talking about them. That meant I could get speaking engagements with the New York NCGR. Wow. So I went through a couple of years of doing asteroids and the blank, whatever the theme of the particular conference was. So that ultimately resulted in the Ultimate Asteroid Book.
You never taught me asteroids.
And I won't, because I literally haven't done asteroids in over 30 years.
Wow.
It's not that I disapprove of them, but they don't work with classical. It's just you're in two completely different dynamics. What happened was, the funny thing was, I didn't propose the name Ultimate Asteroid Book. You know, the name kind of was thrust upon it. And what it became was, when I got done with the book, I just moved on. Well, as that was happening, my partner, Maggie Meister, had heard of the Regulus edition of William Lilly and wanted it. So I gave it to her, a copy of it to her for Christmas one year. And she was absolutely thoroughly impressed. And I looked at it, and at the time I was looking around for what to do next because I really was ready to get out of asteroids. And I had been toying with the idea of looking at essential dignities, but I was looking at it from a modern standpoint because that's what was around. And then here is Lilly. I'm looking at the full tables of essential dignities, and suddenly, doing. And so I started looking at it that way. Well, Maggie signed up for Olivia Barclay's qualifying horary diploma course. And she signed up for it. And in those days, you sent away to England for your lessons, pre-internet stuff. Olivia had asked a question in the first lesson of what rules the lime tree. And, you and I are going to say lime, green fruit, right?
Yeah.
Rather sour.
Mm-hmm.
So you think about, what do you think is going to rule a lime tree? Mars? Sour, right?
Mars is sour, yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, like all the citrus, so Maggie sends that back, and she gets this note back from Olivia. Basically, you silly twit. Everybody knows that the lime tree is ruled by Jupiter because its branches are like forked lightning. All right.
Wow.
Well, you don't tell an Aries something like that. You just don't. So Maggie is holding the letter in her hand, basically having a WTF moment when nobody knew the expression WTF. And she's saying, what? Well, my background's botany. So I look at this, and the first thing I realized was that when you say lime tree to a Brit, they're talking about the linden tree, not the citrus lime.
You know what, Lee? When you initially said what rules lime tree, in my mind, I was thinking lemon because, I think we tend to conflate limes and lemons together. And I was thinking the sun. And then when you mentioned,
because it's yellow.
Right. And then when you mentioned green, I was thinking about Jupiter, but I wasn't thinking about Jupiter because of the branches of the tree. I mean, don't all trees have branches that look like forked lightning?
Okay. Now, this is where the rest of my chart picked up, because I do have this background in botany, and I do have Mars rising. And so I do have a very over-involved Mercury.
Mm-hmm.
So what happened was, because of the botanical background, I said, well, number one, we have the wrong plant. Number two, is it true that plants that have branches like forked lightning are in fact assigned to Jupiter? So what I proceeded to do was go out to the bookstore, buy a copy of Culpeper. Again, no internet to do this.
Mm-hmm.
Create a database on the computer with all of Culpeper's rulerships, where I could add into the database what kind of branching pattern it had. And then I established that, in fact, plants that have forked lightning branches are not necessarily ruled by Jupiter. But then when I did a second cross-correlation with what it was used for medicinally, Jupiter-ruled plants are used to treat Jupiter-ruled diseases. Duh!
Mm-hmm.
So what I did was I compiled this as a printout, and it was about 300 pages. Sent it to Olivia and said, when you say this, you are duly wrong. You are wrong because this idea of the plants being like forked lightning isn't real. And here's the proof. And by the way, you're talking about a different plant than any American.
Wow.
So, I mean, that's about as Mars as you can get, right? So anyway, Olivia wrote back. And she said, you must take my course.
Wow.
And she actually comped me into it. And so I did take the course. But in the process of doing so, Maggie and I both found that this whole business with letters back and forth to London, well, not to London, to Deal, was not working.
Yeah.
And so I had a speaking engagement um, in England, and so we went over and we sat at her table and worked 4 lessons over the course of about 2 days. And so that was how we really got into it. But all this time, I hadn't been thinking horary because I had just been doing natal astrology to that point, a little bit of mundane, a little bit of this, a little bit of that. But in the process of working with William Lilly, horary came alive. And you either get horary under your skin or you don't. Most astrologers just don't get exposed to it at first.
Right.
But when it's under your skin, you have to scratch the edge.
Right. Wow, Lee. I've known you for years and I've never heard the story of the lime tree. And so
Oh yeah.
I'm even more happy that we're doing this interview now. But Lee, I think that you're absolutely right about getting that horary itch and needing to be exposed to it first. Because when you and I connected and I started apprenticing with you, that is essentially where we started our journey together. And I think that it's so important the things that an astrologer learns through the lens of horary astrology. Because, like you, I started off doing natal astrology, which I think is the rule of the day. You enter astrology and you read your own birth chart. But when I came to you, that focus was shifted in the direction of this question based astrology, which I think is absolutely brilliant because after you've spoken to someone for 30 minutes or an hour or even 2 hours about their personality, they next want to know, well, what's my financial destiny going to be like? What's my relationship to my community going to be like? What's my relationship to my home going to be like? Will I have children? What's my relationship to sickness and illness in my life be like? What's my relationship to my spouse going to be like? So people essentially have questions of their nativities that can be answered through those nativities if you have a horary perspective or if you are working within the framework of horary astrology that has first taught you how to answer questions. And that's really the most vital thing that I learned from you. And it's something that I impart to my students to this day.
Now the funny thing about that is, when you started listing that off, Mychal, I thought about that as just typical classical natal. And I think
Yes.
that's the issue. What I think, and I can talk about this as a teaching method. When people start learning astrology through natal, which is, as you say, the primary way, because that's how we hear about astrology primarily,
Mm-hmm.
that you do learn, as you said, a kind of a psychological approach. Well, you've seen me read classical natal charts with no psychology at all,
Yes.
and how different that is, and yet how the same it is.
Yes.
But I think the thing is that with horary, the specificity of it, because it's not just how our relationship's going to be, but is Charlie cheating on me? It's the specific ones, because natal astrology should deal perfectly well. So I was talking to a client this morning, and she's talking about changing careers. Now, this is something you absolutely can do in natal astrology. But if she wants to say something like, I have this court case coming up, and I'm probably going to end up having to deal with being fined for this particular thing. Do I need to sell the property I own on Main Street? That's a horary question. But all the things that you might be saying about the career change and the timing of the career change, that's all natal. But what you're addressing really is this. From a teaching standpoint, if you already know natal, going and studying horary in the classical mode from one of the schools, which is most of the classical schools, that teach what's called general astrology, is really what you want. Because one of the things you can do with your mind, and we all know that we periodically have to play tricks on our minds in order to progress.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things you do with your mind is to say, I'm just going to use this method in my horary.
Mm-hmm.
And so you put this little barrier down, which is, of course, completely imaginary.
Yeah.
But you put the barrier down and say, this is my natal practice, this is my horary practice, this is my natal practice, this is my horary practice. And it allows you to use horary as your sandbox while you actually learn classical technique. And what you then find is that on a theoretical level, about 2/3 of what you learn is general astrology, is directly applicable to a natal reading, but it's easier for you to learn when you're in your sandbox.
Yes. Yes. Absolutely. And Lee, as you say that, I look at the course that I'm currently teaching my students, and it's called Foundations of Classical Astrology. And truthfully, we've spent 3 months together, and the entire 3-month period has been learning classical technique. It hasn't necessarily been about interpreting their birth charts or anything. It's been about learning classical technique. And then their entry point into astrology is, now here's a horary chart about a person wanting to know, will I get a Mac computer in 6 months?
Mhm. Yeah.
Yeah, like now apply what you've learned in our course of general astrology together to this chart and answer the question specifically, will this person get a Mac computer in 6 months? And it's amazing how learning general astrology and applying that within the field of horary astrology doesn't only create more critically thinking astrologers, but it also gives the neophyte astrologer a framework within which to apply the astrology that they're learning safely. Because the thing that a lot of neophyte astrologers do is they grab some astrology that they're learning and they automatically apply it to reading people's birth charts. And
There's a concept there. The concept is called accretion, and this is having to do with how we learn. And it's a very important one for us to understand as we all are attempting to learn. And that is that what happens when you get a new piece of information? Okay, so for example, in learning general astrology, one of the things you learn is a concept called translation of light. Translation of light is where a faster moving body, generally the moon, connects together to other planets that either wouldn't connect or would have connected too slowly. I sometimes refer to that as the Yenta concept. Somebody comes in and says, "Hey, darling, there's somebody I have to introduce you to," and it brings two people together in a way that either wouldn't have happened at all or would have taken longer.
right.
Now, this is a concept that can apply. It applies primarily in something like horary, where you've got a time frame where somebody says, "Am I going to get married in the next 2 years?" Okay, there's a translation of light. There's your immediate idea with it. As you're learning these concepts, you start to see how this can be applied in other forms of astrology. And of course, the more of these, vivid examples you get, the better it works.
This takes me back to something that I heard Rob Hand say in a lecture once, where he said, if you've been thoroughly trained in classical horary astrology, then you know how to practice classical medieval astrology. And I think that that is such a
Right.
powerful thing, because back in the day, they were coming to astrologers to ask them questions of their nativities, which had very little to do with their personality and their psyche, even
Nothing.
though even though in medieval astrology, if we read the works of Guido Bonatti, we do see that the very first portion of his book on nativities is dedicated to understanding the soul of the native.
Right.
So it fits within the context of our classical medieval approach. However, you have 1/12 of the chart after you've spoken about a person's psychology. You have the other portion of the chart, the other 11/12 of that chart, to dedicate yourself to in order to answer these questions that this person has about life. So our horary understanding, it becomes of vital importance to our natal understanding when we actually work with clients.
And I think there's a point that you raised here, which is very important. 1/12, but even less than 1/12, because you also mentioned an important word in this. You talked about soul. Psychology is one particular approach to how we operate. but it is not the totality of the first house. It's a subset.
Yes.
Now, what you're referring to in Benani's work there is really how does this entity operate? And I think one of the differences is when you look at this concept in the classical mode, what you realize is, first of all, there is a soul intention, SOUL intention, that normally isn't discussed because, well, we moderns don't talk about this much. It's embarrassing. We'd rather talk about almost anything else. But that also, a lot of this stuff has manifestations on more levels than just kind of a behavioral analysis, which is unfortunately where psychology mostly is today. But with all this stuff, and to go back to this question of accretion, the issue is the way most people who come into modern astrology learn to operate is, okay, so I'm going to read, arguably Liz Green's book on Saturn. And so you're going to get all these concepts from Liz. It's a very rich book.
It is.
People are still getting mucho out of this book, however many years afterwards. But now what they're going to do is, and this is the tendency, so they read Liz on Saturn, and then they pick up Rob on Saturn, or they pick up somebody else on Saturn, and what they do is they try to mesh all of these. So when people learn from different sources, I would describe this as basically the way that people learn about things. I would say almost in, sometimes I've referred to it as Talmudic, but it's really more of the way that people operate. For example, in many religious classes, it's like you learn something about how your religious practice treats morality. It's what do we believe? How do we act? And then you encounter a different work. This might be going from dealing with a Jewish source to a Christian source to a Buddhist source to a Hindu source. And then what you try to do is say, okay, now these are the ways that they're all the same. And you try to get them all integrated. Well, that's what people typically do if they don't think about it, because you're kind of encouraged to do this. With every astrological book you read, you then try to get into that framework you already have. What I'm going to tell you is don't do that. Because for many reasons, historical and philosophical being good ones, and practical, modern astrology is very different than ancient astrology. And there are even some subsets in ancient astrology where you need to keep things separate, such as Hellenistic and medieval. But even though there are overlaps, it's best to keep some of these pieces separate because you have to know where you got things from. A very simple example of that was years ago, before I wrote and published the Book of Rulerships. All of the books that were about astrological rulerships that were being published, the primary one being Rex Bills, simply listed that, that apples are ruled by Venus. My book lists who says that apples were ruled by Venus. Now, there's actually a big difference between that. Because I remember one rather amusing piece of this, which is some years later, Michael Moncasey got very interested in this idea of rulerships, and he published several books on it as well. But he never tracked his sources.
Right.
And so what would happen is Michael would go to an astrology conference, and we'd all be sitting in the bar, because that's what you do at an astrology conference, right? That is the purpose of it, right? And he'd come in, there'd be a group, and he'd say, what do you think rules teachers' grade books? Okay, well now, what just happened in this is that a group of people who practiced astrology in completely different ways were asked off the cuff, what rules teachers' grade books? Who said what was not recorded, only what was said was recorded. And then there's the issue of, had any of us ever done an astrology reading of any sort, horary or otherwise, where teachers' grade books had come up as a part of the reading? So Here
Wow.
you have the difference between theory and practice. You have the difference between different lineages and different schools and different philosophies. And now you want to know about teachers' grade books? Well, guess what?
Wow.
And I don't blame Mychal for this, because at the time that he was doing this, nobody was tracking sources.
Yeah. I think the difference is, Lee, and this isn't knocking anyone or where they come from, but if you have a background in research, whether that is something that you learned in university or whether that is just something that is just a personal proclivity of yours, if you come from a very research oriented background, then there's no way in which you're going to not quote who your sources are. And it's something that I've even done for my students. If I'm going to talk about the first house, you're going to know what William Thrasher said about the first house, what Claude Dario said about the first house, what William Lilly said about the first house, William Ramsey, John Gabbery, Joseph Blagrave. You're going to know exactly where these pieces came from, because it is my duty as an educator of astrology to allow my students to know who said what, and also to point out places where two different people, possibly operating in the same period of time, said different things. And I think that that creates a more responsible approach to astrology. And it's something that we owe our students. And it's not just about writing books that are going to be sold, it's about how are we catering to the needs of the new generation of astrologers coming into our field.
Absolutely.
Now, Lee, in terms of the education of an astrologer, I know that you have a very specific philosophy about that. And I've also found this in reading other Renaissance astrologers where they outline what branches of astrology an astrologer should learn first and how that development of an astrologer should take place. Can you tell us a little bit about how you think an astrologer should be trained, or where do you think an astrologer should start and where they should go to?
Well, I can tell you how it was done.
Mm-hmm.
And then I can talk maybe a little bit to the practicality of whether that works. Okay, so if you're looking at the philosophy of how this happened in the history, Bonatti is a really good source. I mean, I could go much earlier because we could look at Abu Mashar, we could certainly look at Ibn Ezra's work. Many, there were many things that occurred before Bonatti, but Bonatti's a good example because it's a hefty work. And up to that point, the typical process was to write relatively short treatises. In Bonatti's work, he divided it up, and the first portion of it is exactly this general astrology. Because what he talked about, what are signs, what are houses, and he talked about it not merely from the standpoint of, and this is the glyph for Aries, but he talked about the philosophy of why these things are true.
Yes.
And in this section on general astrology, he goes through how the system fits together, what the components of it are, and then he starts going through a lot of vocabulary that, frankly, a lot of modern astrologers don't even know, because it's now considered to be horary words, like translation of light, like perfection, that actually are general astrological concepts. And then it's after he goes through the section on general that then he starts dividing up the work into books. And fairly quickly, but not immediately, he does horary, he does lectional, he does mundane, and then he actually spends most of his time toward the end on natal.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I can see that as a teaching practice, because in reality, if you really could start people anywhere in astrology, horary would be the best place to start. It's immediate, it's simple because you're dealing with one question, not a multiplicity. So you only have to deal with a few symbols. And so it's short, it's quick, and you get an answer. And so which ends up being remarkably important, because if you are learning astrology and you're doing, and you're doing natal readings for people, and you say, well, you're very nurturing, how many people are actually going to say, WTF, I'm not nurturing? It's like a lot of the way that natal is done is when you start getting into describing people, our words are either vague enough or such that most people are going to grab onto them. It's when you get to the specifics that they know that you know your chops. It's when you can actually make predictions, when you can say, you really tend to be anal about this particular thing.
Mm-hmm.
That, they either say, no, I am, or no, I'm not, or yes, I am. I mean, it's one or the other. And so you can't learn if they don't say, no, I don't feel that really applies.
Yeah.
No, this didn't happen to me.
Right.
So horary has that incisiveness, and incisiveness trains the mind. So I do think horary is a good place to start. In William Lilly's Christian astrology work, which is, on a par with Bonatti as far as major works,
Yeah.
he started with horary, which was actually unusual, because there's a very short section at the beginning, relatively, on general astrology, and then he just dives right in. And by the time he gets to natal, it's almost a footnote.
Mm-hmm.
And there is a degree to which that can be true, but it's a footnote only because you've gone through the rest, and only because now what he has to teach you in natal are the things that you don't do in horary, which are things like looking at the temperament, looking at some of the medical issues, the physical issues of the body, how directions work, how solar returns work. I mean, there's a portion of natal, but it makes so much more sense. The thing is, horary isn't generally what gets people into astrology. And what gets most people into astrology starts out with the sun sign columns, and then moves into the idea that there's a natal chart, and tell me about me and me and me. Oh, yes,
Yeah.
and my girlfriend. Um, and so it's almost like that becomes the driving force, because that's people's lives and people's experience. But really, you can do it either way. But I think the point is, if you aren't focusing your teaching around general astrology, then you don't really have a good philosophical and structural network and skeleton upon which to hang everything.
Yes. Yes. I absolutely, positively agree with you. And I was just having this conversation with Luis Ribeiro from Portugal, in which we were saying the same thing. We have to give our students a scaffolding upon which to build their temple of astrology. And without that scaffolding, then what we end up with is this very loose pap astrology that is diffuse and has no centralizing organizing factor that allows all of the pieces to come together. And so I love that you continue to hold on to this piece where horary astrology becomes central to the training of an astrologer, because it is within horary astrology that we not only learn all of the things that we need to know in general astrology, but we also learn how to be incisive with our vision and with our methodology of how we approach charts, period.
I agree with that. I think one of the things that I remember is there's a wonderful West Coast astrologer by the name of Nikki Michaels. Nikki was actually the person who did the chart computations for Joan Quigley
Wow.
when she was working Reagan's chart. Joan was actually kind of afraid of computers that were just coming in at that time. And Nikki was a dealer. She had a bookstore with the DR70, which was a standalone astrology computer.
Wow.
And so they had this interesting little relationship for years. Nikki never really totally She knew she must be doing something, but Joan was pretty cagey. But Nikki was also a direct student of Dane Rudhyar. Now, we can look at the history of 20th century astrology, and Dane Rudhyar is certainly one of the giants, legitimately, in the field of a combination of psychological and spiritual astrology, because psychological would just be too limiting for his approach. Now, I mention this because, on the one hand, you talk about psychological approach, and a lot of psychological astrologers get very nervous around the concept of prediction. Part of this is over a whole philosophical issue about what free will is. But one of the things I wanted to point out with this story is, Nikki told me some years ago, Rudhyar predicted her marriage. Now, he predicted it on the level of, and you will get married, and I don't remember the exact time, but whether it was an approximation like months or a year. But the point was, he said this to her.
Wow.
Now, here is, as we would think of it, a pure psychological astrologer, pure modern astrologer, making a prediction like that she didn't ask for. Okay. But the point is, this is so intrinsically a part of our craft. And I think the thing is, it's very difficult to be able to make predictions on a consistent basis until you master general astrology.
Yes.
And that's the truth of it.
Yes.
So this is part of why I say, learn these things, learn them as separate entities. Don't try to mix them with what you already know. Simply think of this as being like a different language. And there's there's a medieval astrology language, there's a Hellenistic astrology language, there's a Jyotish language, there's a Chinese astrology language, there's a modern astrology language. When you can think of it that way, then you're onto it. And yes, there are some that are more related to each other than others, French and Spanish. And there are others like Chinese that seem to be totally unrelated to it. But the point of it is that it's learning the system and learning how the whole system operates. And then you've got a power behind what you do that, if you haven't experienced this, I can tell you is unbelievable.
I've experienced it. And once again, Lee, I'm so grateful that you and I connected when we did, because all of my life I had thought that I was operating within a classical framework of astrology, insofar as I felt completely comfortable making predictions based on a chart. But when I learned horary astrology with you, it just took it to a whole new level, because here it is, we don't necessarily have a chart that is connected to the native in any direct causal link, in the same way as we may look at the natal chart as belonging to this person. So horary astrology and entering the waters of horary astrology made me challenge questions of even causality within my own unconscious belief system. But it also made me that much more fearless, I think, in terms of saying yes or no. And in terms of looking back toward the natal chart of a person to corroborate that yes or no, which is also something I learned from you. And also looking at the soul return chart of a person to corroborate things that the horary chart says. So, Lee, my entire approach to astrology today, what I teach my students, the book that I'm writing, which is essentially about horary astrology and the natal promise, it comes from the work that you and I did together, because in every way possible, what we did was about looking at the horary chart in isolation and seeing what that has to say, and then going to the natal and going to the soul return chart as points of confirmation. And in July, I'm actually going to be taking a group of astrologers through this same process, a group of intermediate astrologers who would have already had a firm foundation in classical astrology, to show them the interlinking ways in which the horary chart ties into the natal moment, and the way in which the natal moment ties into the soul return chart, to show that all branches of astrology feed each other. but it starts with the understanding and the training and the incisiveness that we get from the horary process.
Exactly.
Now, Lee, we've spoken in a very circuitous manner, and we're coming back to the heart of where we were supposed to be focusing on in the first place. I want to give you, Lee, the platform to define for our listeners and our viewers, who for the most part are the astrological community, what is horary astrology?
Horary astrology is the astrological process of answering specific questions. Now, I could give you a slightly more historical answer, but I'm going to give you practical answers here with a few historical citations. But that's essentially what a horary does. Horary is the astrology of questions which people have always had. It's important for us periodically to remember that astrology did not develop as natal. Astrology had been going on for centuries before anybody thought to apply it to a natal chart, or even that there was such a thing as a natal chart. So, but people always had questions. And so from that standpoint, there was always the possibility of attempting to divine an answer from the stars, which were ultimately associated with divinity.
Wow. So, Lee, a central word that I heard you say was divine. And we both know that the larger context or framework within which that word operates is divination. So, what then is the definition of divination, and how does that tie into our relationship with horary astrology?
Well, you have to get Jeffrey Cornelius. You just have to, because he's done more work on this than any of us, I think. But basically, what I would say is this. The stars, from the stars we came, the stars were always seen, I think, culturally as part, not always the whole, but part of the representation of the divine order. We can't get there. You know, they are above us, literally. They are out there shining, and in that sense, there's not anything we can do about it. So the thing is, to divine is to invoke a higher order. Okay, so I have a question that's really bothering me. And I mean like really bothering me. And it's not just a simple question. It's not just, will I marry so and so? It's not just if I engage in this business, will I be successful? It's the kind of soul-wrenching questions we occasionally get. So here I get one of those questions. How do I answer the question? Well, it's not always satisfying to just go around to your friends and say, what do you think about this? The process of divining was bringing in guidance from above, and I make faces because I'm always cautious about the multitude of ways that we can see powers and processes beyond us. But that's really a divination, is an attempt to communicate with a power or process that is beyond us. We would add generally more powerful, that somehow would have a special knowledge which we lack. And basically, by here it's we humans. So humanity has developed a multitude of ways of attempting to do this. And whether it's when you're doing a tarot spread, whether you're throwing coins, whether you're watching the flight of birds, all of these methods are basically an attempt to get an answer from a power beyond. Now, horary is one part of that, because that was one technology. And I would argue that while we can go through a whole history of the development of astrological techniques used for this purpose, that on a real primary level, questions are questions, whether you're answering them through the Ching or whether you're answering them through astrology, which is to say horary. That's the first piece. And the thing is, you can't really talk to your clients about things this way. The most we can do is really try to sort out when people are asking you what we would call a burning question versus, Lee's giving a lecture on horary at this conference. I'll ask her a question. And it's just really because I happen to be there.
Mm-hmm. Lee, I love your definition of divination. And what I teach my students who are coming in to learn, whether or not they're coming in specifically to learn astrology, or if they're coming in to learn some other branch of astrological divination that I teach, what I tell them is that divination is the art and science of establishing a bridge of communication with the divine via an established symbolic language. And for us as horary practitioners, our established symbolic language is horary astrology. It is the sky. For the tarot reader, their established symbolic language are tarot cards. Someone who works with the I Ching, their established symbolic language is the hexagram. The geomancer, their established symbolic language is the geomantic figure. And we all have carved out an established symbolic language with which to speak to the divine. And that's something that we hone through our training, and that's something that we hone through years of experience. But at the end of the day, it is a conversation that we're having with a force or a source that we consider to be greater than our own limited body of knowledge. But another thing that I have really been working with philosophically, and I've been working with it within my practice as well, is this concept that the astrology of the moment, the horary moment, constitutes the moment of divination across the board. So,
Absolutely.
so if someone is coming in for a tarot reading, the moment of that tarot reading is a horary moment. Someone is going in for an I Ching consultation. The moment of that consultation is a horary moment. And my working philosophy, and it's something that I'm writing about in my book on horary astrology and the natal promise, my working philosophy is that these external tools of divination, the Ching, the tarot, the geomantic figure, what have you, these external symbolic tools of divination only crystallize for us in pictorial form the astrological influences of the moment. So the ghost within the machine behind the tarot isn't some disembodied spirit. It is that the tarot is crystallizing the horary chart within those tarot cards. And I feel as if the same thing applies to the runes, geomancy, I Ching. And I've seen that time and time again within my own work, that if we compare the divinatory method that we're using to the horary chart of the moment, the parallels are stunning.
And it's
Which
a good reason why, if you're doing tarot, you need to take down the time that
hmm
you put out the spread.
hmm And I feel as if it isn't because the cards influence the cosmos and cause the cosmos to align itself in such a way whereas it crystallizes an answer. But I believe that that reading can only happen at a particular moment in sacred time in which the cosmos is predisposed to reveal its answers to the diviner through those cards.
And specifically about the querent,
Yes.
because
Yes.
the querent is so much a part of the process as well.
It's absolutely mind-boggling and staggering, this understanding of our astrology and even of our affiliated systems of divination, because it looks squarely at this question of fate versus free will, and it demands an answer. Because those of us who operate within the field of divination, something that you said to me once, Lee, was that I could never make a living with 70% accuracy. And that has become my motto within my astrology for life, because I couldn't make a living as an astrologer with 70% accuracy. So there is something about the predictive work that we do through our horary astrology and other systems of astrological divination that looks this question of fate versus free will squarely in the eye, and it demands an answer, because we could not operate within the world if there wasn't a background of fate upon which to cast these charts.
However, let me throw a different approach to this. Okay. So the thing is, there, as the medievalist would have thought of it, there is this unchanging cosmos. God initiated it. I'm just reporting. God initiated it. There is a regularity that is provided by the whole regularity of the cycles of the planets, their spheres, their epicycles, the whole 9 yards. And so there is this unchanging and yet changing process that's going on all the time. And their cycles are running all the time, and they are bigger than individual humans. And yet, 99.97% of your life, you are not plugged into any of them consciously. Okay, and I think this is the point. Because when you talk about a horary moment, which is like when you talk about somebody coming and, working with the deck, and then the deck is revealed if you're doing tarot, or if it's when the sticks are thrown or the coins are thrown in the case of Qing, whatever your method is. This is a moment where the querent comes together with the diviner into a partnership and association in which that moment is then revealed. But the rest of the time, you're just going through life. Now, I would argue that the intentionality of the moment of that divination actually brings in a different kind of fate, because what you've done in that moment is you've brought in a kind of a divine fate. The ancients understood that there were many different kinds of fate, of which one of the most important was the fate of ignorance, that you will do if you don't learn better otherwise. Mm-hmm. So don't stick your finger in the lit candle. But there is something that goes on in those divine moments that relates to that which is present, not just physically, but cosmically. But we can't live in those moments all the time. We can't even live in them the majority of the time. So, I think that one of the things, when astrologers talk about fate and free will, too often it looks like a binary either or, what I would call a false dichotomy. It's actually a much more complex situation, but what happens in those dividing moments is a crystallization of the question as really being the entity which can be studied as a separate thing. John Gadbury, in his work, The Genethliologio, talked about the nativity as being the birth of the body and the horary as being the birth of the mind. And it was that level of crystallization, which is what we're really referring to, and saying that those crystallized moments can be divined, they can be read. And the symbolism is awfully, absolutely gobsmacking, deliberate and obvious and overwhelming.
Mm-hmm. Whew. Ling. There was something that you said to me once, Lee, that was quite profound insofar as this topic of fate versus free will is concerned. And it's something that takes me back to an aspect of Vedic philosophy in which they divide the qualities of nature into sattva, rajas, and tamas. And this tamas for us in the West corresponds with our alchemical salt, or that which binds us within materiality. And the reality of tamas, or salt, as an alchemical astrological concept is that something as it is isn't trying to be something else. So the tree outside isn't trying to be the flower, and the flower isn't trying to be the bee, and the bee isn't trying to be the sun isn't trying to be the moon, and the moon isn't trying to be the earth. And you, as a person who has gathered your life around you after decades of life, you're not trying to change. Truthfully, at our heart of hearts, there is something within us that would rather stay as we are than shapeshift into something more evolutionary. And I teach yoga as well, and I know that the struggle is real every single morning when I'm in my bed sleeping and I hear that alarm go off that it's time for me to get up and prepare for my yoga class, because there is something so satisfying about staying asleep. There is something so gratifying about not getting up and practicing yoga for 90 minutes. There is something so gratifying about eating the entire container of ice cream and not going to the gym. There is something so satisfying about these things that appease our materiality, that when we're faced with the actual conscious decision to change some aspect of ourselves in a critically evolutionary way, we don't. And the example that you gave, Lee, which I love, and I tell it to my students until this day, is that think about going to one of these astrological conferences where, people have on the badge that says, this is my rising sign, this is my sun sign, and this is my moon sign. And think about you as a person, say you're a triple Pisces or something, and you decide that you're going to walk around all day with Scorpio, 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 Scorpio rising, Scorpio sun, Scorpio moon. Think about how difficult that is to actively alter the the momentum of your nature in order to try to be completely archetypally scorpionic for an entire day. It requires a level of effort on our parts that is just not something that we are consciously willing to maintain 24/7. And I think that the point that you were making was it is within that context of the momentum of us where this question of fate or free will really really comes into play, because the momentum of us oftentimes becomes the fateful part of our lives. And at the end of the day, a lot of us aren't really exercising free will against the momentum of who we've known ourselves to be over decades of being alive.
I think you can look at this from two different ways. You can look at it as the example that I gave, which fortunately I remember. I'm happy to hear that. But there is that, what that really speaks to is a level of bodily inertia, really,
Yes.
that we're so used to operating. But, by having that inertia, we create a particular kind of body. Now, we can, through intention, change that inertia. Every time you get up with the alarm, you're at least challenging the inertia, even if you haven't gotten rid of it. And in the meantime, you have succeeded in getting to your yoga practice yourself, let alone what you teach others, for long enough to have achieved a number of results of that yoga.
Mm-hmm.
But now the question becomes, do you then create an ego construct around the fact that you have done the yoga practice? I'm using you.
Yeah.
Because you're in front of me. And then now what constructions do you make out of that on a spiritual level? And how does that then affect your body? There's the interactions are so complex. Oftentimes with astrology, what you can show is that, for example, I get a lot of medical questions, whether it's medical questions or medical natal work. And I see a lot of that as being simply because there's so few astrologers that are willing and able to do that. But when somebody's, asking you about, a serious medical problem, um, at that point, what is your free will and what is your fate? Because I think at the point where something develops to the stage where it becomes an illness, what you have is this is where your fate has brought you. But where fate is a combination, not just of I am a Taurus, but your fate is also here are all of the decisions I've made in my life. And that pathway of decision, whether starting from free will or not, achieves a particular body that now is about to experience something different and experiencing a consequence of this whole process. And so I get back to, with an illness, where is the fate? Where is the free will?
Well, I think this brings up a very interesting point, Lee, because going with this question, are there some things within life that are indeed fated? And then are there some things in life that are indeed truly operative within the parameters of free will as modern society would have us believe in it? Because my personal relationship to this is that given the full length of your life, each and every one of us is going to live out our natal promise. And that's something that I honestly believe in my heart of hearts, after years and years of living with astrology, each and every one of us is going to live out the fullness of our natal promise. So how much of that living through the destiny of the tapestry of our charts actually allows us the wiggle room for true expressions of free will, versus in the situation like a disease or illness, how much of that is probably just hereditary and inbuilt within us and inescapably an expression of fate?
Okay, let me give you a thought on that. Let me give you a story. So earlier this week, I had a client who had joined a spiritual community 40, 50 years ago that is vegetarian, and where he's been vegan now for 10, 15, 20 years or more. And we were looking at his solar returns, and this was not a horary one, this was a natal one. And his situation is, his health situation is extremely compromised. Now, operating strictly on the level of the traditional medical humoral system of the elements of fire and earth and air and water, what I realized is that he is protein compromised. Now, having worked with spiritual communities myself over the years, I'm perfectly aware of the fact that it's known, for example, this is known among Indian practitioners, for example, that as we age, we tend to need more protein. Now, this can be a real conundrum when you're talking about somebody who, for ethical or spiritual reasons, chooses to be a vegetarian. It's different, obviously, if you simply chose to be a vegetarian because you concluded that was the healthier lifestyle for you. But now you're up against the fact that you may not be able to be purely vegetarian. Okay, now at this moment, is a free will issue. Mm-hmm. But it's one with a lot of fate pieces as well as free will pieces coming into this, because this is the person who has viewed the alternative of eating meat for a long time as being within this lifetime, essentially, verboten. And where there's also an ethical consequence. It's not just, I don't like how Scorpios act. It's, I'm really offended by the idea of eating meat. And, you think about many of the vegans who maybe they weren't that way when they started, but the association of this with the ethical treatment of animals. And now you tell them, you need more protein if you're going to stay alive and stay healthy. Now, I'm not saying this happens to every vegan. I'm not saying this happens to the majority of the vegans, but this can happen.
Mm-hmm.
And so now what we have is a genuine physical medical condition where the person is being challenged with what to them is actually an ethical concern, or alternatively, they are literally going to be going around their elbow to get to their ass to try to work out a pattern of eating that requires so much attention and so much consciousness applied to it to evade the simpler thing, which would be have fish once a week.
Yeah.
So that gives you the dynamics that not all of the choices are fixed, but what we have to be aware of is that the choices we do make set up a chain of consequences. And I think it's the chain of consequences which is really the realm in which a lot of so-called fate occurs.
Lee, I hear what you're saying in terms of the relationship between fate and free will. And as practitioners, you and I, who are in the field daily, in the trenches, doing the work, we come to realize that it's far more nuanced and, like you said, it's far more complex than a leaning in one direction of it being either completely a fate-based cosmos that we're operating in, or it being completely a free will-based cosmos that we operate in. And we've seen how the two of these things come together to create a very extraordinary life for us all, if indeed we are able to overcome the fundamental basic inertia of being ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that it's a brilliant and a more holistic vision of this concept of fate versus free will, because, and correct me if I'm wrong, it seems as if the working philosophy is that free will is a radical operative force that is working within the parameters of what can largely seem as fate.
Yes. Let me show you a chart. We have a horary chart here called the surgery. Okay. So let me not do it the way that I experienced it temporally, which is that I spoke to this woman by phone, and she gave me the circumstances, and she asked the question. So just as general technical pieces for people who haven't done horary, a horary is taken for the moment that the astrologer understands the question, and that's the virtually universal historical definition of the time of a horary question. So I understood the question at 11:51 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time on May 5th, 2020, in my location, which is near Silo, North Carolina. So that is the technicality of this chart. And then the horary techniques will tell you how to interpret the various people and the various things she's asking about. So she was asking about she wasn't asking something as simple as, should I do this surgery? But she was asking, what would the consequences of the surgery be? Okay, so if we walk the chart, we have the ascendant always gives the person asking the question. So she comes out as the sun, Leo rising. So she's the sun in Taurus. And this is highly appropriate because the sun is in the 10th house. When you talk about having a surgery, it is a medical procedure, and medical procedures are given to the 10th house anyway. Now, the fact that her ruler is in the 10th among other things, tells me she's got juice behind this question. She's really trying to work it out.
Mm.
So that's her circumstance. We also see that Mercury is there, it's combust, and Uranus is there, it's under beams. Now, when somebody asks about a surgery, one of the questions is what will happen with the surgery itself? But the other question is going to be, does it actually address the disease that's present? Because let's hope that people aren't going into surgery as a cosmetic surgery if there isn't something wrong.
Right.
So any illness the person has is given by the sixth house. So the sixth house here has Saturn ruling the sixth house, and in the sixth house here in Aquarius, we're all classicists, so we've gotten past thinking of Uranus. Okay, well, what I want you to notice is Saturn is sitting right at the seventh house. Now, in a medical chart, the seventh house is whoever the healthcare practitioner is, and I'm very broad in my definitions, but since we're talking about surgery, this would be the surgeon. Saturn is dignified in Aquarius. So what I know immediately is the surgeon is competent. Okay, the surgeon probably is senior, well-respected in his or her community, yada, yada. The things you'd expect out of a dignified planet. However, Saturn, we can see something else here. Saturn also rules the eighth house. Now, unlike some of the modern schools of horary, the eighth house is death. Why? Because we always must give death a place in medical questions. It is one possible outcome, even if it is the one we want. But so I'm already nervous with the surgeon and death being ruled by the same planet, as well as the disease. Okay, this is not a configuration I'm real happy about at this point. But more than that, Mars rules the surgery. Totally appropriate, because Mars and surgery are one. It is a sharp instrument. Knives are specifically ruled by Mars. Steel is specifically ruled by Mars. You get the concept. So here's our procedure, Mars. It's at the eighth house cusp. So what's our answer? Our answer is this surgery will kill her.
Lee, by virtue of the 5-degree rule, would you consider that Mars to be in the 8th house?
Yes, absolutely, just as Saturn is in seventh. So what we have here, from the standpoint of a horary question, a very stark and clear one. I could confidently give this to any of my horary students who are only a few weeks into their learnings, although they would be a little freaked that they were seeing a question of life and death.
Yes.
But it is a very clear chart.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I'm bringing this up for several reasons, and how often are you going to see a chart on death? Not often, but we have to be prepared for it. Because the thing is, if you can't personally acknowledge the possibility that this is the outcome and that you may have to talk to the person about it, you can't do medical charts at all. Because honestly, if you ever get into doing it and suddenly you adopt a position of silence, your querent knows why you're not speaking. You can't dodge this one. But again, not to make too much of a point, but this is a pretty dramatic horary as far as immediately seeing the consequences. So now let me add some layers to this. Okay, so we're seeing here also Saturn ruling the disease, as I said. The situation here is that the condition is cancer. The nature of the surgery that's being proposed would be absolutely stunningly disfiguring.
Wow.
And this woman is in her high 70s or early 80s.
Wow.
Now, you add to that the fact that she has other physical disabilities that have nothing to do with the surgery. And now you begin to see it in a human context. And you also realize that most cancers, not all, in the elderly run their course rather slowly. So this same disease in somebody who was, say, 20 or 30 years old would, in that sense, be much quicker, much nastier, much more virulent. In both cases, likely to be fatal, but only likely to be fatal. But you see, you envision the process differently in the two people. A big portion of the problem here is that her ruler is in a state we call peregrine, which is a state with no dignity, which is a position of weakness. Even though she's in an angular
Yes.
house, which implies some strength, she does have strength of will, from what I could tell talking to her. But her body is wrecked. And now they're proposing an absolutely disfiguring surgery that I have no doubt would result in permanent pain.
Wow.
Now, saying this, how do the ethics and your reactions to this chart change? How do we deal with this issue of fate and free will in this case?
Yeah.
Suddenly, it's not in the same framework as if I hadn't started to fill you in on these other details.
Mm-hmm.
Now, as a horary astrologer, my answer basically needs to be largely the same. I had to tell her that this surgery would most likely kill her, because that's my job. But what I then talked to her about is, can we envision some alternate ways of dealing with the situation that aren't surgery? Because that's my humanity.
Wow, Lee. You know, as I look at the chart, I also see that not only is Lord one peregrine, but the moon is also peregrine, and the moon is also ruler of the 12th house. And if we look in Lily, we see that in his aphorisms for the 7th house, he says that if the Lord of the Ascendant and the moon are also peregrine, then the querent is out of all hope of attaining their desire. And granted, within this question, the lady did not necessarily have a desire per se, but it still shows an omen of foreboding regarding what the nature of the question is going to be like.
Yeah, it's, I'm not trivializing this at all, but I am giving you an extreme example. But this is the kind of power that is in this technique. But also, there are times where it absolutely grabs you by the heartstrings.
Yeah, definitely.
So, but if she's appealing to me with this question, at the same time, she hasn't given up yet.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And Lee, one more thing that I want to ask just about this chart is that we see that Venus, who is ruler of the 4th house in this chart, is in Gemini, but in term. And I know that within the medical work that we do, oftentimes we view the 4th house as being the outcome.
Well, one of the problem here is the 4th house is also the grave. Now,
yeah,
she gave me her natal data, so I didn't treat this simply as a horror. Using the solar returns, I looked at her solar returns for the next couple of years, and they are also grave. So what I was basically looking at, as far as my interpretation of it is that if she does have the surgery, the best possible outcome they're giving her is pretty hideous, beyond the question of survivability. And her chart shows extreme weakness as far as vitality over the next 2 years. Now, I can generically put 2 and 2 together on this. But the thing is, there is also the spirit. If she feels a reason to stay, she can. And I think this is one of the other things we get to is that Lily did some very interesting things with his horrors. there are a couple of odd horaries that are really more mundane questions. One of them involves Essex during the English Civil War. Another is the question about will the presbytery stand,
Yes.
which is a highly technical question, which I know you're going to have Deb Holding on later on. Deb has done more research on the presbytery than any other living astrologer, and probably any astrologer since Lily. She has done some amazing material on this chart. But those kind of questions are really broader than the question of what the querent is able to do. And she's also, in the work she's done on this, research this question of when it is appropriate to ask one of these bigger than I am questions, because most of the time it's not. It's like, if you think about it, as we're all in US presidential election season, whether we want to be or not, there are potentially 4 billion horary questions about who's going to win the election. And you have to know on a base level that all of them cannot possibly be true. So you've got this range of pieces, but the thing is that the mirror, when a question gives you an answer that is not what you entirely want, one possibility is what I would call, Lily didn't call it this, but I try to come up with explanations for what I see. What Lily would occasionally do is he'd, so to speak, re-engineer the context of the question. And that's something in a situation like this where I felt, for my sake, if not for hers, that I had to give her a plan B. Lily has a question about stolen fish. And, I have to admit, the first time I read Christian astrology, I went, what? Because I was thinking of, the first thing that came to my mind is there are no refrigerators in the 17th century. And so if these fish are stolen, I don't want to know what kind of state they're in.
Yeah.
Well, the answer to that is that they kept the fish in water until they were ready to cook. So it wasn't as consistent as I thought it was going to be. But what happened was he had an order of fish stolen, so he asked a horror question. Now, where are my stolen fish? And the chart basically came back. At most you'll get some. They really were stolen, and so sorry, buddy. Well, Lily wasn't satisfied with it, so he used the question of the theft chart to get a description of the thief. He then went to the docks, talked to the people there that he knew, and said, "Do you know anybody of this description?" And he actually got somebody who said yes. And then one of the things you could do in those days is you could basically get deputized. I'm using modern terms.
Yeah.
To be able to approach somebody and and basically say, "Did you steal my fish?" Now you'd get, who knows what would happen if you tried to do it. He did it, and he found the thief. And he found some of his fish, because the rest was on the table having been eaten. But the point was that he started with a horror that basically said, "You're on a luck bill."
Yeah.
And worked it in an astrological way, because not only did he do this process, but he elected the time to go and confront. So he used all of his astrological knowledge to change what would have been the normal flow of time, which is, okay, you lost your fish.
Lee, I know that you have called this in the past defensive driving horary. And it's a term that I think is really applicable, because there are times when we as horary astrologers have to put on our defensive driving hats and really challenge, in a sense, what we see within a horary chart by virtue of this beautiful thing that we have, which is time. Because it stands to reason that if we moved through time consciously, we'd be able to alter some components of the horary chart. But it is defensive, and it does call upon us to be more than mere citizens moving unconsciously through time. It demands that we take a look at what is portended for the future and also make some very specific life choices in relation to that to indeed reclaim our fish.
Yes.
So I think that it's another great reason for us to take up horary astrology, because in taking up horary astrology, we can see more specifically how not just to move through the world by virtue of this broader natal chart within which we all have to function, but we can see how to move within the world in terms of these daily issues that we have that come up within our lives, which is really the beauty and the strength of horary astrology, and why I think more astrologers should be learning how to use it.
Oh, I agree with this. I think the one thing to always remember about this is horary cannot be used for trivial purposes.
Hmm.
And that's really that's a very big dividing line. I mean, I've seen early students of astrology do things like decide they're going to elect the time to get up in the morning. Um, and as an astrological exercise, maybe. But this is not something that's going to work for you over time. Um, you really have to feel that juice behind the moment. And one of the ways that I describe it is when you get to the stage where having an answer has become virtually more important than what the answer is, then you're in a divinatory moment. And we should say divinatory because as we were saying earlier, it's not just horary, it's all divination.
Lee, I love everything that you're saying, and I think that this podcast today opens up the field for me to invite other people from other branches of astrological divination onto the show, because we're all basically doing the same thing but speaking a different language. And I think that when we understand that piece of it, then it creates a greater point of connection and even a bridge between these two worlds that are so similar but yet are still divided. Because, I mean, I can't count the amount of tarot readers who I know who have absolutely no interest in astrology because they feel as if it has no application to their practice. And the same goes for my colleagues who are involved in Yi Jing or runes or geomancy, when in fact we're all speaking the same language. And I think that if we can root our practices against the backdrop of the heavens, against the backdrop of this astrology within which we all operate, then we stand the chance of creating a more holistic and a more unified approach to this mystical consultative work that we're all a part of, whether we're astrologers or not.
Mm-hmm. I would certainly agree with that.
Lee, I am so very happy and so very pleased to have had you on the show today. And thank you so much for mentioning that point about Deb. Yes, we are going to have Deb Holding on the show later on in the year to talk about reception and this mammoth topic that is reception and how it impacts all astrologies. And of course, you do teach as a part of the School of Traditional Astrology, and I'm going to put that link down below, as well as a link to your website. And Lee, if people wanted to get in contact with you for any reason, what are the ways in which they could do that?
The very best way is through email, lee@leelehman.com.
Okay. And your website is also leelehman.com.
Right.
Great. Awesome. Lee, having you here today was absolutely extraordinary. And I already know that I have to have you come back because you touched on some things that we need to flesh out. One of them being electional astrology, and which you've written the book on. I wish I took it off of the shelf earlier. We also need to talk about mundane astrology, which you've also written the book on. I'm not going to talk to you about asteroids in astrology, even though you wrote the book on that as well. But there are so many aspects of your practice, Lee, that I need to talk to you about on the show because you have such a rich and such a textured approach to your opinions and your view of classical astrology that is truly refreshing to be able to sit with you here on the show as my mentor and as my guide for so many years of my life to be able to hear your opinions in this way. So thank you so much again, Lee.
You're welcome.
And for those of you who have been here from the very beginning, I want to say thank you so much for your continued support of the Oraculos True Divination podcast. Please do like the podcast, subscribe to it, and also share this podcast with your other astrological and even non astrological friends who partake in these waters of astrology in some way, whether it's tarot or runes or Yi Ching or whatever their branch of mystical interest is. Please do help us to get this word out there because the world needs to hear from more brilliant astrologers. And that is my sincerest hope in bringing you these podcasts, that you are inspired to go back to your work with a renewed passion and a renewed confidence and to dig your heels into your astrology in a more enriched way. So from the bottom of my heart, thank you so much for being here. I love you. Be well and talk to you soon. Bye-bye. Lee Lehman.